10 gemstones that replaced eyes, ears, and touch in ancient burials. Not every gemstone was meant to be worn. Some were placed into bodies, not as decoration, but as replacements. Archaeologists across 4 continents have uncovered burial sites where gemstones appear not in the hands or around the neck, but inside eye sockets, beneath the tongue, behind the ears, or sewn into the skin. Each was positioned with anatomical precision. Each filled a space left vacant by death. These were not symbols of wealth or beauty. They were used to replace functions the body no longer performed: sight, hearing, breath, touch, memory, and orientation. This film documents 10 gemstones that were not offerings. They were substitutes, and every one of them was found where a human sense had ended. Don't forget to press and hold that like button, leave a comment, and hit subscribe before we begin. Ranked 10th, Obsidian, artificial eyes for the dead. 2 black discs, each no wider than a thumbnail, are locked inside a reconstructed human face. Not flesh, not glass, volcanic glass, obsidian. The sockets once belonged to a man buried over 9,000 years ago. The eyes did not. In the pre-pottery Neolithic layers of Jericho, archaeologists discovered skulls that had been deliberately modified after death. The craniums were cleaned and reshaped, then plastered into human-like mass. But it was the obsidian, fitted precisely into the eye sockets, that drew global attention. These were not grave ornaments, they were anatomical replacements. Obsidian, sourced from distant Anatolia or the Eastern Rift, was traded across great distances to reach these sites. The material wasn't chosen for its rarity or beauty, but for what it offered: permanence, darkness, stillness in cultures where the decay of the eye signaled the loss of self. Obsidian provided continuity. It didn't rot. It didn't shut. It remained. The same substitution appears centuries later across the ocean. Among the Maya, obsidian was embedded into funerary mass, precisely where the eyes once sat. Some were reflective, others matte, but all maintained placement, not for ornamentation, but for ritual function. The Aztecs revered obsidian as the smoking mirror, a substance tied to divine perception and the act of seeing without eyes. To insert obsidian into the face of the dead was not to decorate, it was to restore. In Iron Age Europe and across Indonesia, fragments of obsidian were placed within facial coverings and bone arrangements, once again aligned with where eyes had been. Anthropologists believe these placements were not symbolic, they were surgical. These stones replaced a lost sense, sight, not metaphorically, but physically. Across regions, obsidian didn't just accompany the dead, it stood in for their eyes. Eyes replaced with obsidian, a dark gaze preserved across centuries. But in the ancient world, seeing wasn't enough. The dead had to listen too. Ranked 9th, jet, the stone that took the place of hearing. Burial sites often show patterns, jewelry near the hands, offerings at the feet, but in a subset of Iron Age and Roman period graves across northern Europe, archaeologists noted something more precise and more unusual. Jet, a soft black material of organic origin, was repeatedly found embedded not beside the head, but within the skull, lodged in or near the auditory canal. Jet isn't a crystal. It's fossilized wood, pressure-condensed driftwood from prehistoric forests, compressed into a lightweight, carvable substance with a dull matte finish. It lacks the luster of obsidian or the hardness of quartz, but it resists decay and fracture. That quality may explain its presence in the ears of the dead, but not its placement. At sites from Yorkshire to the Rhine, in burials dated between the 1st century BCE and 3rd century CE, small jet objects were found inserted deep into the ear region. In many cases, the jet was shaped and smoothed into curved plugs that followed the shape of the ear canal. In others, it remained raw, a compact lump carefully positioned in the same anatomical space. These weren't adornments. There were no attachment holes, no fittings, no signs of jewelry. Their only function was to fill a particular void, one left behind when the body no longer heard. Burials involving children often showed symmetry, matched jet inserts in both ears, paired and aligned. Adult female burials showed similar placements, sometimes with jet accompanied by small ceramic discs, suggesting a tiered funerary protocol. But nowhere in the same cemeteries was jet found in the mouth, hands, or torso. Its presence was anatomically exclusive. Ears only. The ethnographic literature surrounding jet includes pre-Christian beliefs in its ability to retain or reflect sound. When rubbed, jet can hold a mild static charge. When struck, it produces a hollow tone. These qualities gave rise to its association with echoes, with auditory memory. In funerary practice, this may have translated into a desire to retain the last thing heard, or more symbolically, to equip the dead with the means to keep listening. Anthropologists reviewing these burials argue that jet's function in this context was not protective nor commemorative. It was prosthetic. In an age before the language of medical substitution, jet may have served as a stand-in for a lost sense. Its role was not to evoke sound, but to occupy the physical space where sound had once been received. No metaphors, no abstractions. A literal replacement of the auditory organ with material that outlasts decay. Yet in these graves, they did not honor the ear. It became it. The skull was not the only space where gemstone substitutions occurred. In other cultures, it was the mouth, the breath, the tongue, the act of speech itself that had to be replaced. Ranked 8th, Carnelian, the stone placed where breath once lived. The mouth amulet shall be made of carnelian, placed in the mouth of the deceased on the day of burial, to restore the speech of the one who has lost it. Instruction from an Egyptian funerary papyrus, 18th dynasty. In the mortuary tradition of New Kingdom Egypt, carnelian was not worn, it was inserted. Oval in shape, smoothed by hand, the stone was placed directly between the lips or behind the teeth of the deceased, occupying the exact space where the breath had once entered and the voice once exited. Unlike other gemstones found in necklaces or arm rings, this carnelian had no setting, no chain. It existed to fill an anatomical void, the open mouth of a body no longer capable of speech. The belief recorded in both the Book of the Dead and in priestly instructions for burial rites was that carnelian could act as a substitute for utterance, restoring the ability to speak during judgment in the afterlife. In royal tombs, carnelian mouth amulets were sometimes accompanied by a reed placed beside the tongue, reinforcing the role of the mouth as a passageway for voice, for breath, for divine pronouncement. The placement was never decorative. It was always functional. Beyond Egypt, excavations at Ur and Kish uncovered similar uses. Red-orange stones, identified as carnelian, were found lodged between jawbones or resting beneath the tongue. In some cases, the upper palate was sealed with clay, and the carnelian stone marked the final entry, the last thing placed before the tomb was closed. In the Indus Valley, early burials occasionally reveal carnelian set into the base of the mandible, aligned with airflow, suggesting a shared logic across cultures, that the mouth, once emptied by death, must be refilled with something enduring. Geologically, carnelian resists weathering. It maintains its color. Its surface retains shape even after millennia underground. Unlike porous organic material, it does not decay or shrink. When placed in the mouth, it remains there, inert but present, as if waiting to be spoken through. The dead no longer breathed. They no longer cried out. But in these funerary practices, they were not left voiceless. Carnelian stood in that space, in the opening of the mouth, as the one thing that could remain where breath had once been. Sight, hearing, breath. But not all senses reside in the head. Some cultures feared losing the ability to feel and embedded gemstones into the body to stand in for touch itself. Ranked 7th, turquoise, the gemstone sewn into the skin of the dead. In multiple southwestern Native American burial sites, archaeologists found turquoise, not worn, not carried, but stitched. Small pieces, irregular in shape, were threaded into the fabric that wrapped the body or directly into softened layers of preserved skin. The placement followed no ornamental logic. It followed the map of the human sense of touch. Along the forearms, around the fingers, down the spine, turquoise appears where nerves once transmitted contact, pressure, sensation. Among the Hopi and Zuni, Turquoise was believed to link the earth and the sky, but in mortuary use, it marked the human body itself. When the skin could no longer feel, the turquoise was applied in its place. In some burials, turquoise chips were sewn around the fingertips. 10 stones, one per digit, spaced with ritual precision. In others, a single polished piece was embedded at the center of the palm, pressed into place, then bound in ceremonial linen. It was not decorative, it was positional. The placement corresponded to parts of the body most associated with physical contact, where touch had once mediated the world. In Scythian graves across Central Asia, warriors buried with amputations or skeletal trauma showed similar insertions. Turquoise beads were inserted beneath the skin, where limbs had been lost, as if the sense of feeling had to be replaced, even if the body part was gone. There is no written doctrine explaining this, but the anatomical logic is consistent. Unlike metals or harder stones, turquoise has a soft texture and thermal neutrality. It warms quickly against flesh. That tactile compatibility may have contributed to its role as a substitute, something close to skin, something that could be touched even if it could no longer feel. The final layer of funerary wrapping often concealed these placements. They were not meant to be seen, but they were meant to be there, occupying the zones of contact between the body and the world it once moved through. When skin failed, turquoise filled its place. Touch had its substitute. So did breath, hearing, and sight. But in some burial systems, it was the emotional core, the heart, that needed a replacement. Ranked sixth, Chrysoprase, the stone, that stood in for emotion. In a burial near modern-day Krakow, dated to the 4th century CE, archaeologists recovered a single gemstone, polished, intact, green, lying squarely over the sternum. No chain, no clasp, no grave goods beside it, just the stone and bone. The material was chrysoprase, a nickel-rich variety of chalcedony not commonly found in Roman grave contexts. It hadn't been worn, it hadn't been inserted. It had been placed intentionally and symmetrically at the center of the chest, precisely where the heart had once been. This was not a one-off discovery. Additional excavations across southern Poland, eastern Slovakia, and parts of the Western Balkans revealed the same pattern. Individual chrysoprase specimens set at the exact location, unmoved, unstrung, and aligned with the anatomical midline. In each case, the body's soft tissue had long since vanished, but the stone remained, anchored by nothing but its weight and intent. Unlike mouth amulets or eye inserts, chrysoprase wasn't associated with external perception. It wasn't connected to breath, sound, or vision. Its only association was with presence, emotional, cognitive, or spiritual. Early Christian funerary texts referred to chrysoprase as a stone of comfort, but in these pre-Christian burials, it seems to have served a different role, a stand-in for the part of the self that felt. In anatomical terms, the region beneath the sternum houses not just the heart, but the vagus nerve, the diaphragm, and the core of the body's reactive system. A body stripped of its emotions or its memories would lose sensation in this space first. Chrysoprase may have been selected to occupy that physiological absence, to replace a function that could not be preserved by flesh alone. Its placement was never replicated in the throat, skull, or limbs. Only the chest, only the center, and always without attachment. No inscription, no gold, no metaphors, just a green stone where feeling had once lived. The center was accounted for. So were the senses, but in specific funerary systems, even the direction of the soul required intervention, and gemstones were used to orient the dead. Ranked fifth, Lapis Lazuli, the stone inserted where memory had been. In a royal grave from ancient Sumer, a human skull was recovered intact, except for one thing. The cranial cavity had been opened, and where soft tissue had once filled the interior, a small slab of blue stone now rested, perfectly cut, deeply embedded and anatomically aligned. The stone was Lapis Lazuli, not a pendant, not an amulet. It was placed within the emptied skull, occupying the space once held by the brain. This wasn't unique. Across burial sites in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and parts of Central Asia, lapis lazuli appears in positions inconsistent with decoration. Some pieces were recovered from inside the cranium. Others were inserted through nasal or ocular openings, then set into the cavity after excerebration. The removal of brain matter as part of elite mortuary practice. At Lapis was sometimes accompanied by small clay seals or copper rods, tools used in post-mortem cranial rituals. At Kish, several adult burials show lapis placed flat along the inner parietal bone. The pieces were neither large nor elaborately carved. Their role was not visual, it was positional, deliberate. In early Egyptian tombs, lapis lazuli was occasionally set into the forehead, fused into funerary mass, and directly aligned with the center of the frontal bone. These placements reflect no known style of adornment. They follow only one rule: proximity to where the mind had once been. Lapis was not used in the mouth, hands, or limbs. Its presence was reserved for the skull, and almost always the skulls of individuals from administrative, spiritual, or royal classes. Geologically, lapis lazuli is not rare, but its ultramarine hue, shot with pyrite, made it perceptually distinct, difficult to confuse, impossible to overlook. In the absence of gray matter, this blue stone took its place. These cultures did not preserve the brain. They replaced it, and lapis, silent and inert, remained, not as ornament, but as residue of function, a fixed proxy for what had once been remembered, decided, and known. When the mind was gone, lapis remained, but some rituals didn't replace organs. They replaced direction. They placed stones to guide the soul itself. Ranked fourth, amber, the fossil resin that replaced breath. Amber is neither mineral nor metal. It was once alive. Tree resin, secreted to seal a wound, then left to harden for millions of years beneath sediment and pressure. It contains no crystal structure, no lattice, no grain. But when exposed to even slight warmth, it releases a scent, volatile, organic, instantly recognizable. That property may explain why, in some ancient funerary systems, amber was selected to occupy the space where breath had once passed. In burial sites along the Baltic coast, amber was discovered not as jewelry, but in anatomical placement. Small, irregular nodules set near the nasal ridge, directly aligned with the nostrils. These stones were unstrung, uncarved, and lodged without support. The position was not decorative, it was physiological. The nose had collapsed. Air no longer moved. Amber was introduced to fill that void. In the inland steppes of Ukraine, Scythian graves dating from the 7th to 5th century BCE show more invasive use. Some skeletons had been disarticulated and repacked. In those reconfigurations, amber was inserted between the ribs symmetrically, sometimes in pairs, placed precisely where lungs would have inflated. The amber used in these cases was spherical, polished, and soot-darkened, with burn marks visible under magnification. No ceremonial vessel accompanied them, no incense. The heat marks suggest the amber had been heated briefly before interment, releasing its internal compounds. The implication is specific. The stone was meant to substitute the air or to recreate a breath that could no longer be drawn. In southern Anatolia, within late Bronze Age cremation sites, layers of compact ash occasionally reveal amber residues fused into bone fragments, but not scattered. They appear clustered at what would have been the upper chest. The absence of amber elsewhere, not near hands, mouth, or offerings, confirms that these placements were not devotional. They were respiratory. Amber is uniquely suited to this role. It is light enough to rest on collapsed tissue. It is porous, allowing slow diffusion of aroma. And it persists, not through hardness, but through traceability. Even centuries after burial, amber can be detected through gas chromatography. It leaves a chemical signature, much like breath once did. Where air had once passed, amber was placed. Where lungs had emptied, the volume remained. Where scent had lingered, it became the last detectable presence. Amber didn't symbolize breath. It replaced its absence with a residue that could still be sensed. The invisible had form, the fleeting had substance. But some burials didn't aim to preserve what was. They sought to prepare the dead for what they would enter next. Ranked third, amethyst, the stone placed where sleep no longer ended. In a 3rd century BCE tomb outside Thebes, excavators recorded something not worn, but rested upon. A violet-purple crystal, flat cut, placed beneath the cranium. It hadn't rolled there. It hadn't slipped. The burial wrap was still intact. The stone had been inserted intentionally, as part of the layer between the body and the earth. It was amethyst. This wasn't jewelry. There was no perforation, no housing. The stone was nestled beneath the base of the skull, aligned with the occipital bone, the region that governs visual processing, orientation, and unconscious balance. The brain had dissolved, but the placement remained. In Greco-Roman funerary texts, a specific term appears, hypnolithos, the sleep stone. Referenced in select burial rites, it was not described as a charm, but as a state maintainer, something introduced to assist in the preservation of resting silence. Across Rome and North Africa, scholars documented sarcophagi with thin sheets of amethyst pressed against the occiput, occasionally sewn into the shroud just below the nape. These inclusions were not symbolic. They were positional. They suggest that sleep was not an event, but a condition that had to be structurally supported after death. In later Levantine tombs, similar placements are found. Unmounted amethysts layered between the rear skull and funerary padding. Not visible, not referenced, but preserved in sediment. Their consistent anatomical targeting marks a departure from magical thinking. These were not talismans. They were substitutes for something physiological, the capacity to rest, to stop perceiving, to remain in stasis. Amethyst does not dissolve. It does not change hue over time. When placed at the base of the head, it absorbs no breath, reflects no sound, and offers no visual impression. It simply sits in the exact place where consciousness had once existed. Sleep was no longer possible, but sleep was preserved. Sleep had a form. So did breath, voice, and sensation. But in certain traditions, the body wasn't just preserved, it was prepared to withstand chaos. Ranked second, malachite, the stone. Applied when sight no longer functioned. In burials across pre-dynastic Egypt and early Phoenicia, archaeologists found traces of green pigment clinging to the orbital bones of the dead. Not on the eyelids, not painted and pressed, as thin slices, ground residue, or fitted inlays, over the closed eyes or along the upper nasal ridge. The pigment was malachite. Soft, opaque, easily ground malachite was used in cosmetics and medicine. But in mortuary contexts, its placement followed no cosmetic logic. It wasn't for appearance, it was for replacement, not of vision, but of something adjacent to it. Orientation, perception, awareness after sight. In tombs at Saqqara, face masks recovered from the 18th dynasty show signs of malachite under the eye cavities, embedded between wood layers. The material was not visible during burial. It existed within the mask, where the eyes would have been. In Nubian burials, malachite spheres were placed under the eyelids before mummification and never removed. In Phoenician graves from Tyre to Byblos, flat malachite discs were positioned at the forehead center line, not worn, but applied like an insert. The anatomical reasoning is consistent. These placements correspond not to the eyes themselves, but to regions of the brain involved in non-visual processing, spatial mapping, memory, and orientation. Once the biological eye failed, malachite marked its limits, and then occupied its function. Unlike other burial stones, malachite was rarely placed in the mouth, hands, or chest. Its usage was restricted to regions of cognitive access, the eye and forehead. And unlike obsidian, which replaced the act of seeing, malachite appeared designed to receive. It absorbed no light, it reflected no image, but it remained, in the cavities where the world had once been sensed, to hold the position of something now lost, not the organ of vision, but the possibility of inner direction. The brain had stopped processing, the eyes had closed, but malachite was inserted to replace not what had been seen, but the capacity to perceive it all. Sight replaced, memory substituted, voice, breath, and touch accounted for. But in a few rare traditions, a final stone was reserved, not for a sense, but for an arrival. In first place, Moonstone, the stone set where the body no longer moved toward anything. The apex of the skull bears no muscle, no sensory receptor, no action center. In living humans, it serves no voluntary function, but in a series of high-altitude burials from pre-Buddhist Tibet, 6th century Japan, in Iron Age steppe nomads, this precise point, the cranial vertex where the parietal bones converge, was marked with a single object, a polished feldspar fragment, pale, opaque, unset. It was placed not in the mouth, not under the head, but directly onto the crown, above the sagittal suture, where no ritual tradition had reason to linger, except this one. The material was moonstone. It is a member of the feldspar group, consisting of intergrown orthoclasts and albite layers. Its defining feature, adulorescence, occurs when light enters the stone, scatters between internal lamellae, and exits as a spectral sheen. The effect cannot be seen until the stone is moved. But in death there is no movement. And yet the stone was placed precisely where motion no longer emerged. No regional burial tradition describes Moonstone by name, but the anatomical evidence is aligned. Across dozens of Himalayan and Kofun period sites, Moonstone appears only once per body, and only in that location, never elsewhere. It is not held in pendants, not sewn into garments, not carried in hands. In several cases, the base of the skull had been slightly shaved post-mortem to receive it, ensuring alignment without adhesive. In others, a depression was formed in the burial cloth to hold it during decomposition. Moonstone does not represent a sense. It does not replace breath, sight, or hearing. It replaces directional capacity, the ability of the body to orient, to ascend, to respond to above. Once the reflex ceased, the stone was placed, not to symbolize but to occupy the last coordinate of vertical cognition. Its function was not to restore anything. It existed only to confirm that orientation had stopped. Unlike every other stone in this burial system, Moonstone is not about preservation or transmission. It marks the termination of spatial agency. When every other point, eyes, ears, lungs, heart, had been substituted, there remained a final node where the body had once known which way was up. That too was closed. And in its place they left a feldspar with no inscription, no movement, and no surface that could face anything. None of these stones were placed by accident. Each one was positioned where something had failed, disappeared, or been removed. They did not commemorate the body. They corrected its absence. Across centuries and cultures, when sight, hearing, breath, or emotion could no longer be sustained, something enduring was inserted, not to restore life, but to finalize what was lost. These 10 gemstones were not chosen for beauty. They were used because they stayed. Let us know which one resonates with you in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.